Um, chapter 4 says, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So this statement in verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, I would say is the thesis of this section and possibly of the entire book of Proverbs. And so if we're going to understand what the fear of the Lord is, first we have to finish up this list of roles that the passage gives for wisdom, for the book of Proverbs, but also just for wisdom more generally. So verse 4a says to give prudence to the simple. So our takeaway from this is just obviously prudence is a virtue. Prudence is cautiousness, if you don't know. And to say that prudence is a virtue is to say a good way to apply that is to a good modern example of how we can apply prudence is by staying within 5 miles an hour of the speed limit versus if you're going to go 20 miles an hour over the speed limit just because you know there's no law enforcement around, right? That's imprudent and therefore that is immoral. That's sinful to be uncautious in that manner. Verse 4b says, knowledge and discretion to the youth. So it's the full phrase then would be to give knowledge and discretion to the youth. So to be naive and to be innocent are not the same thing. The pursuit of knowledge is virtuous, and ignorance, therefore, relative to the amount of information you have access to, is complacent and sinful. So don't be ignorant. Inform yourselves. Keep a reasonable amount of knowledge constantly on within your memory, within your mind. Because to be willfully ignorant is again sinful. Verse 5 says, let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. The pursuit of knowledge is wise. It is an aspect of wisdom. And seeking wise counsel is humble and good. And it is often humble to seek wise counsel. I have a friend that I often have to, or not often, but whenever I'm in need of wise counsel, there's a friend of mine that I'll call who is younger than me. And it does take some humbling on my part to make that call. And maybe I don't as often as I should. So make sure you are seeking out wise counsel when it's necessary and that you're humbling yourself enough. You're humbling yourself in doing that. Make sure you are willing to seek wise counsel. Verse 6a says, to understand a proverb and a saying. So when you approach a proverb, remember to slow down and take time to actually seek understanding of its meaning and not to merely apply it. Although application of it is fundamentally the fruit of the book of Proverbs. It's the most direct fruit of the book of Proverbs, but there is actually more fruit of the book of Proverbs than just application. So make sure you take time to slow down and understand a proverb's meaning, because then you can have a greater understanding of the Lord our God. Verse 6b says, the words of the wise and their riddles. The full phrase then would be to understand the words of the wise and their riddles. Now, what does this mean? This language, and it's even more in the NKJV, the version that I usually read from, it's even more to the extent of it even more has this connotation of sort of a concealed meaning in the Proverbs, right? It says riddles. And in the NKJV, it even says enigma for the word saying in verse 6a. And so what is Solomon getting at by describing this concealed meaning in the Proverbs? Well, here's the thing. Some Proverbs are too complex to be fully understood semantically, which means in words. To have a full understanding of its meaning to have a deep enough understanding of a proverb's meaning that you can put it into words is not always possible. A good example, and this isn't a proverb, this is just later in chapter 1. Later in chapter 1, there is a verse that states that if you answer the call of wisdom, then the spirit of wisdom will be poured out onto you. Now, I will be a much older, wiser man before if I ever do, have a complete understanding of what exactly that means for the spirit of wisdom to be poured out onto you. However, what I do have an implicit understanding of the idea that the spirit of wisdom being poured out onto you is a is an ends which you ought to be oriented toward, meaning that you ought to seek that out, even if I don't have a full semantic understanding of what it is exactly. Okay. I'm not done. Sorry, I'm sorry. We have one more verse. Chisholm, can you unlock this? I have one more verse. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Verse 7. Okay, so before I get to verse 7 is almost the pinnacle of this entire book, the entire book of Proverbs. But first, let's recap. It's the verse 7a says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." This is knowledge because the book itself is knowledge. The book itself isn't wisdom because wisdom is action, right? So this is the knowledge of wisdom. And so this knowledge that verse 7 is referring to is described in verses 2 through 6. And just to summarize real quick what we've learned so far in verse 2 in verses 2 through 6, what we've learned so far is that to be wise is to understand wisdom, to act in justice, to be prudent, to avoid ignorance, to seek wise counsel, and to study and apply Scripture. That is what this knowledge is referring to, the knowledge of how to do those things. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. What exactly is the fear of the Lord? Well, as human beings, we often act in fear, whether it's fear of loneliness, fear of the state, fear of law enforcement, fear of you name it, right? Fear of not being accepted. There's a lot of things that we act in fear of, and we're almost constantly, if you really pay attention to your own actions, we are almost constantly acting in fear of something. And so the idea of the fear of the Lord being a virtue is that if you fear the right things, then you'll always act correctly. You'll always act in virtue if the Lord is truly what you fear above all, right? And so that is to say that knowledge is therefore a virtue. And if you truly fear the Lord more than you fear anything or anyone else, then you'll pursue knowledge in all circumstances. So for example, if you live in a country, think the Lord that we don't, but if you did live in a country where there is no free flow of information, then you have to fear the Lord more than you fear the state. And if you fear the Lord more than you fear the state, then you'll pursue knowledge even in that circumstance. For us, the pursuit of knowledge, all you have to do is fear the Lord more than you fear effort, because that's all it takes for us to obtain knowledge. And yet, vast majority of us do not put in time outside of what's required of us to put in the effort to obtain knowledge. And so therefore, a lot of us, including myself, I'm talking to myself just as much as I'm talking to you, are fearing effort more than we're fearing the Lord our God. Verse 7b says, the fool despises wisdom and instruction. So the fool makes the choice to reject wisdom because he fears that which opposes wisdom more than he fears God. If you want an example of what this looks like, I'll give you one. So I was working a morning shift, and this guy came in. He always comes in at 8 o'clock whenever I'm working at a morning shift, and he always comes in with a drink from Eli's, which is a coffee shop in Metamora. And so I was just talking to him, just trying to make some conversation, and we started talking about Eli's. I asked him what he ordered. We were talking about just Eli's compared to other coffee shops, and then I had a perfect opportunity to say something about how Eli's is a great place to do Bible studies with my friends, because that's what I think of when I think of Eli's, because that's most of the time I'm there. That's the reason why I'm there. But I was scared that he might flippantly dismiss religion as a whole if I brought up my Christianity. I was scared that the situation might get awkward, right? So I feared these things more than I feared the wrath of God, because I didn't mention the Bible studies. And so therefore I put myself in the path of the wrath of God. I made myself in my actions worthy of the wrath of God. And so therefore I was fearing social awkwardness and him dismissing religion more than I was fearing God. And so the takeaway is to not be like me in that instance and to fear the Lord more than you fear the things of this world. Thank you.